Now, if you would have tagged France against Spain, that would have been a different role because France plays with long passes. But Spain playing more of a tiki-taka game, and Argentina...
more of a what?
We call it tiki-taka.
Tiki-taka. That's made up. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. You heard us say tiki-taka. That is about soccer and Spain and their strategy. They're going up against Argentina on Sunday for the World Cup final. But there are questions about the pitch, that is the grass at MetLife Stadium, and what they're playing on. We're talking about that. Plus, we have the Trump speech, the president's speech tonight at the White House. And he's talking about what we're being told, election integrity. Up first, though, the U.S. war with Iran is fully back on. And today, the U.S. military went even further, striking near the capital, Tehran. Iranian officials say that recent U.S. strikes have killed at least 35 people and wounded more than 300. And Iran has responded by firing missiles and drones at U.S. allies in the region. Now, a major reason for this reignition is the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. is trying to reopen. So I want to bring in Keir Simmons, NBC News chief international correspondent. Hi, Keir.
Hey there, how you doing?
How much do you feel as if this war has escalated in the last few days?
Well, it's escalated a lot, and it's escalated in the same way and in a different way. So for people listening, watching, I guess they're going to be those who are feeling like they're going through Groundhog Day, but there is a difference, and frankly, it's a worrying difference, and that is this, is that the last time we had this escalation like this, for example, President Trump threatening to target civilian infrastructure in Iran, we hadn't got to the point where the two sides, Iran and the US, had negotiated to a deal, the memorandum of understanding that we managed to, that was achieved. This time we have. So they are now fighting over that over what that memorandum of understanding means. I mean, I like saying that effectively Iran and the US can't even agree on what they agreed upon.
On what they agreed upon, yeah.
Yeah, and that raises the question, how they're going to get back to the negotiating table. We're into, night after night of US strikes and of Iran's targeting tankers and targeting Kuwait. They say US infrastructure in Kuwait and Bahrain, and sometimes here in Qatar, for example. All of that we're experiencing, but in the context of a big question, which is, how do we get out of this?
And if we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, Keir, I think there's a real question of what's actually going on, because the president had said he was going to instate this 20% tariff, tax, essentially, toll, really, on ships moving through. And then he made an about face on that 24 hours later and said, no, that's not what's going to happen. I'm going to get Middle Eastern countries. They want to invest in the United States. And so that's how we're going to deal with the passage of those ships. In fact, though the blockade is back up, there has been some traffic through the strait. But when I looked at the maritime traffic this morning, which who knew, that's something that I'm now looking at these days, most of the ships are passing through the Iranian passageway. And so it's still Iran that is managing the strait, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, I could go down from where I am now and jump on a ship and sail to the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it wouldn't be a sensible thing to do.
But no, you
not
may
right
not make
now.
it out.
But look, I mean, there's hardly any shipping going through there again now. And talk about Groundhog Day, we're kind of back to, it just feels familiar, doesn't it? To talking about a sort of economic game of chicken where the Iranians are trying to hold out that their economy will get through this while they try and hold the Trump administration's feet to the fire. And the Trump administration is trying to put pressure on Iran, on Tehran, without the world economy going into deep crisis. And this is where I do think that there is justified criticism. I mean, there's many ways in which there's criticism, and you can argue justified criticism about how this has all gone. But one very important example of it is that this all began with the Trump administration talking about going in to help the people of Iran and tackling Iran's nuclear program. And now it seems to be the only real objective is to try to get the Strait of Hormuz opened, at least in the short term.
Which was open.
Right. I mean,
was open.
You can't avoid that fact, right? I mean, the Strait of Hormuz was open, and now it's not open, and now the conflict is about trying to get it open.
And then amidst all this, the president announced on Truth Social that there was an American citizen who was being held in Iran since 2024 and in fact now released. And he said the U.S., quote, appreciates this gesture of goodwill by Iran. Do we know why it is Iran decided to release this American citizen, what the story is there?
Well, I can give you my judgment, and that will be that the Iranian government or parts of the Iranian government are trying to take steps that show that they are up for negotiation, potentially compromise. They're trying to sort of open the door just a little fraction to the Trump administration. I think that though is not the same as the Iranians saying we will compromise on the fundamental things here. We had the leader of Iran's negotiating team, Mohammad Ghalibaf, give a really, really important address this week. And it's been reported as him holding out an olive branch because he said the Iranian people should not fear war and they shouldn't fear negotiation. That negotiation doesn't mean compromise. He said that ultimately the negotiation is about achieving Iran's security objectives, and that Iran will not back down from its position around the Strait of Hormuz. And so is that the Iranians, Mohammad Ghalibaf, opening up to the potential for a compromise, or is that him just working to explain to his own people why he's still negotiating and keeping the door open, but only in the sense of, yeah, we'll get around the table and talk, rather than that we're prepared to do anything different than we did last time when they reached that MOU.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think I've been thinking about this, conflict a lot recently, and I've been thinking about it in terms of whether or not the United States fully understands the Iranian government and the Iranian people and the way in which, and the reason to which they feel so convicted in continuing on in this war and defending themselves in the way that they do, and whether or not the Iranian government has actually learned more about the U.S. government and this administration in particular. I think that's kind of part of this ongoing conflict, is that they have not learned a lot about each other.
Yeah.
Keir Simmons, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So the president is giving this prime time address tonight, and he is supposed to talk about election security and voting machines. The president says the speech is going to contain really big news. So I want to call on our chief White House correspondent, Garrett Haake, for more on what we can expect. Garrett, I was watching the White House press briefing. I know you were in the room. You asked a question. And a lot of folks tried to drill down with Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary, about what this speech was going to be about. What do we know, especially when there is an ongoing war with Iran, which I just talked about with Keir Simmons, that will likely maybe not be in the speech?
Well, Karoline Leavitt indicated that Iran would likely come up, at least briefly, at the top. But the majority of the speech, it does seem, from the balance of the reporting and from the White House's comments on it, will be about election security, as they describe it. Leavitt indicated that the president's going to declassify some kind of information. She said Americans would be relieved when they hear what the president has found and what they're doing. And she said, in answer to my question, something I thought was interesting. She said that Americans should have the most secure elections in the world, and perhaps they don't. That's the kind of thing that drives folks in our business crazy, given the amount of time and energy and efforts that's been spent counting and recounting, auditing and investigating the last several election cycles, but notably 2020, which the president is obsessed with, all of which have found no indication whatsoever of any kind of widespread fraud or efforts to actually steal anything like the president described. So that bit will be, I think, controversial in and of itself. She also indicated, and I think this is less of a surprise, that the president will advocate for the Save America Act, which is this elections overhaul bill that he has been almost singularly focused on for months now, that has passed the House in some form but has been stuck in the Senate. And tonight we'll use the bully pulpit to push for it.
So amidst this, too, the president forced out, whatever you want to call it, 3 members of the Election Assistance Commission, which helps administer elections from the national level. Do the president's concerns about elections align with concerns that we're hearing at the state and local levels?
No. Is the short answer. Look, the president's concerns that he speaks about are about foreign interference or about conspiracies about, Democrats trying to steal votes or invent voters, kind of widespread, as he describes it, voter fraud, about which there is no evidence. At the local level, and that's where elections are administered, at the local and state level, the kinds of complaints you hear are about things like staffing and volunteers at polling places. Now, one of the things that the president says that's notionally accurate is that Americans do support the idea of voter ID. A number of states have adopted different provisions. His Save America Act would nationalize that, but it also goes a lot further than that. So even there, he combines, an area in which there is, I think, pretty widespread public approval of part of what he's talking about, and muddies the water by adding components that are related.
People close to the president have been advising him to talk more about the economy, more about affordability. He seems, though, more focused on election integrity and the relitigation of the 2020 election more in particular. The White House press secretary was asked about this in the press briefing today. And she basically said, look, the president can walk and chew gum at the same time.
If we don't have safe and secure elections in our country, we cannot have a country. It is a vital part of our democracy, of our constitutional republic. The president will be speaking about that tonight. And in addition, at the very same time, of course, he is working on all of these economic issues that the American people have at home.
How does that read to you?
Look, I think it's an effort to appear to not be dismissing what has been voters' most significant concern in poll after poll, the idea of kitchen table issues, inflation, the cost of living, and the handling of the economy on which the president gets low scores, and to try to make this about something bigger. But I'm struck even listening to that, the idea that she says America has to have safe and secure elections, sort of plural. Every election federally since 2020, Republicans have won. They picked up seats in 2022. They picked up seats in both chambers in 2024 and won the White House. Is the White House attempting to undermine the elections in which they are also winning? The message is incongruous, and the president has given several of these addresses to the nation now in prime time. None of them have been about affordability. So in that metaphor, I'm not sure which one is walking or which one is chewing gum, but the president isn't really putting the same focus on affordability as he is on election issues. It's just not debatable.
Well, and it's interesting that you said that because Caroline was also asked as to whether the president would accept the results of the November elections. And maybe an add-on to that question would be if, in fact, the Democrats were to win back control of Congress.
I wouldn't even do the add-on because I think that's important. She didn't even caveat it, right? She didn't answer the question. She didn't give a yes or a no, when really the easy answer to give there should be yes. Yeah. And I think a couple things are important here. That answer and the lack of acknowledgement that that the president would acknowledge what is in the 2026 midterm elections should be a warning light for how he's going to pursue policies between now and then. But I think this is also important too. Technically speaking, it doesn't matter if the president acknowledges the midterm elections. By design, the president has no role in federal elections, especially midterm elections. The midterm elections are going to be elections administered at the state level all across the country, including for federal officers for whom the president's approval, acknowledgement, agreement is immaterial. As long as they are certified in their states, as long as they are seated by this Congress, those members will come here and serve, whether the president thinks they're legitimate or not. And I think that's important to understand as well.
Garrett, it's a tricky thing to cover this president, especially when it comes to election security and election integrity. How do you prepare for coverage like this, especially knowing, forecasting what may be to come, what we've heard from this president before?
Well, I'm fortunate to have lived a lot of this in real time. I mean, I covered the 2020 campaign, both the president's campaign and President Biden's campaign. I covered the immediate aftermath. I was in the Capitol on January 6th, and I covered the January 6th committee hearings that came after that, which covered a lot of this same ground and the search, fruitless that it ultimately ended up being, by Republicans to find some evidence to support the conspiracies that the president was pushing. There was none then. There's none now. What makes tonight interesting and challenging is the allusion to, from the press secretary and some of the reporting, that there'll be newly declassified information that could somehow shed additional light on this. If it's classified, it means I haven't seen it yet. So it's hard to know exactly what might be coming. But it's also hard to imagine that there's anything that's been in the U.S. government's possession since November 2020 or since then that would be so explosive as to confirm any of the president's allegations of widespread fraud and stayed secret. Information like that doesn't tend to stay secret. And so we're going to be trying to parse exactly what's new tonight and what degree it matters in our understanding of what happened in 2020 in real time.
Garrett Haake, thank you, my friend.
You bet.
So much planning has gone into the 2026 World Cup, top to bottom. The security, the ticket sales, all the way down to a single blade of grass. Because what the players actually are playing on, known as the pitch, had to be constructed and curated across 16 host cities. Each venue created its own challenges. But the pitch that has drawn the most criticism is actually MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, which is going to be hosting the finals on Sunday when Spain takes on Argentina. So why are people mad about it? And how could the surface actually affect the play? For that, I want to bring in an analytics expert on soccer pitches, Christian Theil. He is the CEO of Turfcoach. Hi, Christian.
Hi, Yasmin. Thanks for the invite.
It's great to have you. Okay, we got a big weekend ahead of us, and everything is going to be hyper-focused on this game. But it's also about what they're actually playing on, right? You have this company, Turfcoach, working with soccer programs around the world, the MLS here in the U.S., the Premier League in England, the Bundesliga in Germany as well. What do you guys actually do? And explain to it for me in layman's terms, not in kind of science-y terms that we wouldn't necessarily understand.
I'll try my best. So we work with clubs in all of the leagues, and there are certain things that we try to model, ball behavior, player behavior. But in order to model these, you need to know the surface conditions. And the surface conditions are not only the type of grass which is being grown, but it's also the buildup which is below it. And then, of course, the weather, which changes in real time, and the maintenance, which affects all of that. And what we do is we try to get the whole picture together. For example, if you cut the grass at a different height, that will influence the ball roll speed, but also the moisture level will influence the ball roll speed. And lastly, talking particularly about MetLife, there's a different grass species to what most of the European clubs are accustomed to, and therefore then maybe players are more likely to be, well, let's say, surprised by the different grass species being used, which has a slightly higher traction by default and plays slightly differently and is also cut at the lower height.
It's funny because I guess I'm naive to this. I didn't even realize it was a thing. You know, I played soccer as a kid. I'm like, you just go out on the grass and you play soccer. But the way in which you explain it makes so much sense, literally down to the height of the grass. In talking about MetLife and Sunday, there have been concerns about this pitch. Yeah. What are the biggest concerns of this pitch? And are they founded? Is there stuff to back it up?
So first of all, I would say that right now they shouldn't be concerned because right now there was the biggest time ever in between one game and another for the crew at MetLife to prepare the pitch, the field. It's pretty simple, right? If you have more recovery time, the grass can grow better and you have more time to recover, right?
Okay.
Then the other thing is that the crew behind it, which is relatively large and very experienced, will be doing measurements, right? So you measure the field on a continuous basis and you try to kind of compare these parameters to FIFA standards, which are established.
Tennis is something that I've been following for a long time. And I think oftentimes when you, for instance, have Wimbledon versus the U.S. Open, like all these different competitions, they benefit certain players, right? Because a player is accustomed to playing more on hard courts or clay courts or grass courts. If you take that example and apply it to what's happening now in the World Cup and soccer, does this pitch at MetLife benefit either Argentina, coming from South America, or Spain, coming from Europe, more than the other?
So normally, if you would, the pitch, given that it's going to be cut at a shorter height because we're playing on Bermuda grass, means that there's relatively probability for higher ball roll speed, and it's naturally higher traction for players. So more cutting movements are going to be easier. Smaller sprints play a bigger role. Now, if you would have tagged France against Spain, that would have been a different role because France plays with long passes. But Spain playing more of a tiki-taka game, and Argentina...
more of a what?
We call it tiki-taka. So the tiki-taka is kind of
Did you just make that up?
No, that's how you... Sorry. No, that's what you literally call the
tiki-taka? Okay,
tiki-taka. That is a bit of like what the, let's say, a school of Spanish football play comes from, which is passing the ball, having a possessive game. And that's why it requires good ball roll speed, right? If you have a high grass length, that's going to be a topic. So I don't think the grass length will be affecting, but what we might see affecting is that as the grass dries out between the breaks, you'll always see at the beginning, after a break, the ball roll will be a bit quicker, and afterwards it will be slowing down. Now, I don't think that Argentina and Spain have such a different playing style that it will be an effect on the game. But Argentina, at least what I've seen in the last games, have been scoring in those last minutes often enough with high balls in very precisely placed by Messi or with shots from outside of the goal, which for both of these factors, that doesn't play a role. For Spanish gameplay, the ball roll is extremely important. And it's known. There have been debates in the past where teams were complaining, Spanish teams when they played abroad, about these teams abroad keeping the grass length higher or trying to make sure that the leaf is very dry so the ball rolls very slow.
So in your estimation, you feel like MetLife Stadium is ready for these players?
Definitely. Who's
going to win on Sunday?
Spain.
Christian Theil. We'll check back in with you next week to find out if you're right.
I hope so, and if not, we have to cut this interview.
Exactly. Christian Theil, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for the invite.
All right, that is going to do it for us. And here's the scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vossoughian. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.